Quite some time ago, I was asked to speak tonight and said I'd talk about writers coming to South Australia and what they thought of it. And instantly, of course, I'm a bit sick of being a trendsetter like this because it usually takes me look like a plagiarist as well. But I was delighted when I got hold of the book, Australia Book to Book, to discover that only 4 of the 28 items deal with South Australia. Once again, the eastern states are under the impression that they are the continent. So, since in my researches I've found many more than 4 people who came here and wrote about it, I'm glad to set the record straight, also to prove that I did have the idea before whoever wrote the book had it. The other thing, of course, is that I have cheated a little, very early. That I can discover, no really well-known novelist or writer came to South Australia. So I have had to take as writers people who actually got a book published. My first set of impressions comes from a gentleman who called himself W.H. Lee Esquire, late surgeon of the Australian company ship South Australia, who wrote a book, South Australian, I must be accurate, who wrote a book called Travels and Adventures in South Australia, 1836 to 1838. I don't think when Mr. Lee published, he even claimed to be a great writer. What he wanted to do was to give, as so many people did in those days, in impeccable and readable prose. Apparently anyone who wrote at all wrote well, or anyone who got published at all wrote well, a simple description of what he'd seen. He wasn't trying to grind any axes, it was a very balanced appraisal. Most of his time was spent on Kangaroo Island, and since Kangaroo Island is our earliest settlement, I'm starting with Mr. Lee. There are very grievous drawbacks on the labours of the farmer in this country. I will enumerate some of them. In the first place, when the agriculturist lands, he'll endeavour, of course, to select the best soil, which is to be found where the largest timber grows. As at the place above mentioned, where I mentioned trees as high as I could reach from the ground, 19 feet in girth, enormously lofty and umbrageous, and growing as thick as an English wood, while minor plants and climbers spring up at their roots and woe betide the stranger who ventures among them. These will defy the efforts of any man to cut down. He must look for an open spot near them, which being found, he must next look for water, then cut down what trees he can and rub up the roots. He must also fence every foot round his land as close as a wall to protect it from the wallabar and the bandicoot, which, like hares in England, destroy all the young corn, while the crows and magpies, et hoc games omne, visit your potato field. Allowing even that the season is unusually wet, and that neither blight nor scalding winds occur, he is yet exposed to the depredations of the parrots, which are, without exception, the most impudent thieves I ever saw, flying down before your face and chattering away until you shoot the very last of the flock. There is in some parts of the island a quantity of kangaroo grass that shoots up in the rains, but I have no opinion of it for sheep. It may do for a few hungry oxen. Potatoes may, I have no doubt, be grown, though probably to no great size, as I never saw an old potato of native growth. One gets the impression they're eaten before they reach any age. He then goes on to say, I have eaten good cabbages, but they came, as did some turnips, from a settlement of islanders at a place 20 miles off called the American River, where the soil, of which I saw specimens, is a fat black mould, exceedingly rich. This river, in the opinion of myself who have seen it, and the nautical men who have surveyed it, as well as the residents, should have been the site of the town, and not the desolate wilderness which has been selected. So much for Kingston. He gets absolutely fascinated by the kangaroo and gives a detailed description of it for the settlers and for people in England who've never seen it. He doesn't go quite, he obviously was here. Unlike one person who wrote a book advising settlers to come to New South Wales and said the most beautiful sight was the flocks of wombats taking off from the hedge at sunset. But not Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee's seen kangaroos, he's measured them, and he knows all about them. And he thinks it's a good place. He thinks it's a really good place. Some persons have considered that the kangaroo would be a great acquisition for our English bill of fare. I differ from them. The English taste is better gratified with what it already possesses than it would be of the kangaroo joint. The flesh of which, however, is far from being contemptible in these regions at the price of it proves, it being at Adelaide 1 and 6 per pound. That was when meat ordinarily was 4pence to 6pence a pound of all sorts. If you succeed in obtaining a young one that is more palatable, the persons who are free from prejudice would give their vote in favour of bull beef.
It may be a curiosity in a pub, but I should ask who would fence an estate to keep so little profitable an animal when you can clear from 25 to 30 feet of the barn with the greatest ease. The joint has not a morsel of fat upon it. I may add that the colonists stew them. The dish is called a steamer. I have seen 4 or 5 pounds of tallow taken out of a female kangaroo, but the flesh is not eatable. The tail makes a most delicious soup, and although myself no epicure, I much prefer it to oxtail. So much Mr. Lee's impressions of the country. He is evidently extremely interested in eating potatoes, kangaroo, narrow and so on. I don't think they live very high off the hog. They're kangaroo out of the early days. The next writer has no name, but simply distinguishes himself by the appellation of one who lived there nearly 4 years. The title of his book being South Australia in 1842. After giving some account of the foundation of the province and a description of its state, he begins to describe to possible settlers its advantages. From its roads made practical and open, 155 miles. The roads in progress, 55 miles. Roads contemplated, 152 miles. To its morals. Quoting from a letter from George Grey, the governor, read in council on the 10th of February 42, he informs us that the highly moral state of the population, added to the great security of life and property, which prevails throughout the province, must necessarily weigh with intending emigrants. He goes on to extol the fertility of the soil in most extensive districts of South Australia, the open park-like character of its scenery and the richness of its pastures, and he quotes approvingly from the observations of a farmer on a South Australian company farm. This will, in a few years, be one of the best agricultural countries in the world. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that this anonymous gentleman may have had a financial stake in the colony, because he has a whole book full of the wonders and glories of South Australia and the advantages of settling there. Somehow I've got a feeling he doesn't name himself because someone might have pointed a finger at him and said, how many shares do you own in the South Australian Joint Stock Company? He does, however, sound one note of caution. The particular class of persons to whom I would, with all confidence, recommend South Australia as a proper field is good, practical Scotch farmers who possess a sufficient capital. Now, many a letter home said exactly the same thing. They all discovered that what you really needed in South Australia to make a go of it was hard work and money. And of course, not many of them published in proper printed book. But optimism actually prevails throughout the writing of one who lived here for 4 years. He doesn't say why he no longer lives there, by the way. He says lived. We have houses more than sufficient. Our roads and bridges are fast increasing and improving. Our port is now perfect. I wonder how many of the people who landed at Port Misery thought that. He is particularly cheerful on the subject of the climate. Salubrity of the climate. This is a subject on which every intending migrant feels a very lively interest, especially every family man. And on this subject there can be no doubt that South Australia presents peculiar inducements. The climate is delightful. During the greater part of the year there is an almost uninterrupted succession of fine weather. Even the winter months, which are June, July and part of August, are very pleasant. Sunshine and showery with occasional gales of wind, very slight frosts, and very rarely snow. The heat during the summer months, December, January, February, is sometimes oppressive, but this is the case for only a few days now and then. There has been little sickness and few deaths. It hasn't seen the graves of winter. I need scarcely say that consumptive persons our climate promises much, and that in many instances it has checked the malady and saved the sufferer. Since TB was the scourge of the whole 19th century, apart from being the romantic climax to many a bad-written novel, this would probably be a real inducement for people to come out here. I know one of my great uncles was seconded for sent away from the Navy, the British Navy, and sent to South Australia to get over asthma. He couldn't have come to a worse place. Schools. He also says there are 12 denominations which are open churches, and there's talk of a publicly endowed bishopric, and of course schools. While Adelaide is so amply supplied with the means of religious instruction, it is gratifying to know that opportunities are enjoyed there of obtaining an excellent education, both by boys and girls. Classical Academy, conducted by the Reverend T.Q. Stowe, an assistant. Classical English School by the Reverend Ralph Drummond. The South Australian School Society, schooled by Mr. Oldham, who starved almost to death, if you remember. He had to ask the governor for help. He didn't have a loaf of bread or a piece of cheese to put on it in the house one day. Infant school beside Trinity Church, conducted by a schoolmistress and a committee of ladies. Young Ladies Seminary by Mrs. Yates and Young Ladies Seminary by Miss Williams. So they were amply supplied with schools. And to add to the almost utopian picture being painted, South Australia was behaving better towards its original indigenous population than many other colonies. From the time of the founding of the colony of South Australia, great interest has been felt in behalf of the native inhabitants of the country. Accordingly, a government officer was appointed under the title of Protector of the Aborigines, whose duty is to secure to the natives the due observance of justice and preservation of their rights, and in particular to protect them from personal violence, to secure them permanent subsistence, shelter and lodging, and to afford them moral and religious instruction. By such wise and just means, it was hoped that South Australia would form an honourable exception to the older colonies in all the different parts of the world, where the extermination of the Aboriginal inhabitants has usually been the consequence of the introduction of Europeans. Well, after such a glowing report from 1842, it's quite sobering to turn to a more temperate description by someone who had no axe to grind. That's Andrew Trollope. He's simply concerned to describe what he saw for people to read about. He was a little biased in Adelaide's favour by discovering that the post office was the nicest building here, because after all, he had been a postal official and had been responsible for the development of postal services in Ireland and in England, and for the planting of pillar boxes all over both countries. And his interest in every city he attended was, of course, to see first what happened to the post office. The one building in Adelaide on which the town most prides itself, and which at the same time the colony is half ashamed because of the expense, is the post office. I was gratified by finding that the colonies generally were disposed to be splendid in their post offices rather than any other buildings. But surely there's no other public building so useful. At Brisbane, when I was there, they were building a fine post office. At Sydney, they had nearly completed a magnificent post office. At Melbourne, I found a very large post office indeed, though, as I thought, one not very convenient for the public. And here at Adelaide, the post office is the grandest edifice in town. It is really a beautiful building with a large centre hall, such as we had in London as long as we could afford ourselves the luxury. We have built up our hall, compelled by exigencies of space and money, compelled, as I think, by sham regard for space and money. It will be long before the authorities of Adelaide will be driven to perpetrate a similar architectural meanness. But surely such a post office will more than ample for the population for many a year to come. I regret to say the arrangements might have been improved by consultation with English officials. As regarding the building as a building, it is a credit to Adelaide, and it would be an ornament to any city in Europe. The government offices are not magnificent, but are pleasant, commodious, and sufficient. The town hall is a fine room and forms a portion of a very handsome building. In such luxuries as town halls, large public concert rooms, public ballrooms and the like, the Australian cities greatly beat our own. Adelaide itself has less than 30,000 inhabitants, and I doubt whether there be any town in England with double that number which has such a chamber for public purposes as that of which I am speaking. I am sure there is none with 4 times the number that has a theatre so pretty, so well constructed, and so fit for its purpose as the Adelaide Theatre. Even little Perth, with its 6,000 souls, has a grand town hall. In regard to banks also, Adelaide flourishes greatly. I must not name anyone in particular, lest it be thought that I am making return for accommodation given. But such was their grandeur that I felt of them generally that the banking profits in South Australia must be very great, or such edifices could not have been erected. Rather the way we feel nowadays about insurance buildings. Adelaide is well provided with churches, so much so that this specialty has been noticed ever since its first foundation. It was peculiarly the idea of those who formed the first mission to South Australia that there should be no dominant church, that religious freedom should prevail in the new colony, as it never had prevailed up to that time in any British settlements, and that the word dissent should have no meaning, as there should be nothing established from which to disagree. In spite of all this, the Church of England has assumed a certain ascendancy, partly from the fact that a liberal and worthy Englishwoman, now Lady Burdett Coutts, endowed a bishopric in Adelaide. If you remember, one who lived there 4 years said there was going to be a bishopric. By 1873, there was a bishopric. That was when Trollope arrived here. But chiefly from the indubitable fact that they of the Church of England who have flocked into the colony have been higher in wealth and intelligence than those of any other creed. So much for most members of Parliament who are non-conformist. It would be singular indeed if it had not been so, seeing the country from which they came had for centuries possessed an established and endowed church. But the very fact that the Church of England boasted for itself, even in this colony, a kind of ascendancy, and the other fact that the colony had been founded with the determination there should be no such ascendancy, have together created great enmity among the rival sects. He goes on to say how good the parks are. Every visitor to Adelaide noticed and approved of our surround of parklands. This was really a novelty and really a true advantage as they saw it. Especially as the trollops views, and later they could see Adelaide extending beyond the parklands, and therefore they would form a kind of barrier in the middle, a breathing space between inhabited areas. They seemed to find this was particularly good. He also liked our gardens, the botanic gardens. Nothing, of course, was as good as Sydney. No visitor to Australia fails to mention how marvellous the Sydney Botanic Gardens are. He does say that in Melbourne the gardens are more scientific, but the world at large cares but little for science. In Sydney, the public gardens charm as poetry charms. At Adelaide, they please like a well-told tale. The garden in Melbourne is as long as a sermon from a great divine, whose theology is unanswerable but his language tedious. I like Adelaide very much, and I like the Adelaideans, but I must confess to my opinion it is about the hottest city in Australia, south of the tropics. It is, however, not excessive for about 3 months. I arrived in the first week of April, and then the weather was delightful. No city in Australia gives more fixedly the idea that Australian colonisation has been a success than does the city of Adelaide. I'm giving you mainly what he thinks is good about the place, but to cheer myself up and to offset what I may say other people said later, that he does mention that it's not very beautiful. The city has background of hills called the Mount Lofty Range, the only pretension to landscape beauty which the city possesses derived from these mountains. It was indeed said many years ago by one much interested in Adelaide that she was built on a pretty stream. The stream is called the Torrens after one of the founders of the colony, but I utterly deny the truth of the epithet attached to it. Anything in the guise of a river more ugly than the Torrens it would be impossible either to see or to describe. During 11 months of the year it is a dry and ugly channel, retaining only the sewerwards property of the river. In this condition I saw it. During the other month it is, I was told, a torrent. The hills around are very pretty and afford lovely views and charming sights for villa residences, and soil and climate admirably suited for market gardens. As a consequence of this latter attribute, Adelaide is well supplied with vegetables and fruit. So, on the whole, his feeling about Adelaide was favourable. And not everyone has the same feelings about it, so it's very nice when a real novelist, a very famous novelist, in my view, a great novelist, has anything good to say about it. Richard Tuppenny published his book Town Life in Australia in 1883, at which time he felt able to declare, Adelaide is a thoroughly modern town, with all the merits and all the defects attaching to novelty. It does not possess the spirit of enterprise to so adventurous a degree as Melbourne, but then neither does it approach to the languor of Sydney, a judgment which I felt might well be reversed if he came back to the conclusions today. In this respect, it has discovered a very happy middle course. There is certainly something very provincial about the attitude of the town towards the rest of the world, but this helps to make it the more distinctive. For its size, I consider Adelaide the best built town I know. Like so many other visitors, he was impressed by the parking, certainly in the city, as well as the squares within the city proper. A splendid idea of what they were. The drainage, he complains, is defective. The actual sanitary laws which were passed in 75, which would make a difference to Adelaide's arrangements, had been passed, but perhaps not carried out to their fullest extent by 1883. Or perhaps they were observed more in the breach. The drainage is defective, but the Mayor, Mr. E.T. Smith, has been so active and vigorous that pavements have been laid, additional gas lights provided, the Torrens artificial lake constructed, and there has been a pretty park made on the banks of the Torrens. This is all the result of the Mayor's activities in 2 years. The shops, except for the silversmiths, are not up to much, and as for transport, Adelaide abhors hansoms. They exist, but are never used by respectable people, who have come to look upon them as unholy in themselves. Of the hotels in Adelaide, the best is York, is better than the best in Sydney, but inferior to the best too in Melbourne. I do get tired of us being compared with Melbourne all the time. However, he considered our botanic gardens a privilege. But everything he says is so new. But what did he expect? He wasn't very impressed by the colonists. The colonist Tiffany says is very fond of owning his own house. And so most colonists are saddled with large mortgages, so what's changed? But since it cannot be too thoroughly understood that Australia is before everything a money-making place, I quote, all of it has to be foregone until the man has made his fortune, and then he has to pay £10,000 for a house he could buy for £4,000 or £5,000 in England. However, the expense does not deter South Australians from giving way to their passion for turrets and flagstaffs, of which every establishment from large to tiny is well stocked. Tiffany meditates on why this should be so and decides it's because they came out here by a long sea voyage, and in some twisted way thinks that has made them want turrets and flagstaffs. They want to plant themselves firmly, he thinks, in the soil after all that tossing about on 6 months on the sea. One of the problems is, however solid looking, they are actually jerry-built. I know, I live in one. The kitchens are terribly small and in summer filled with flowers. Of the sanitary arrangements, it is almost impossible to speak too strongly. They are almost invariably objectionable and disgusting. But Tiffany was convinced that the working man in Adelaide was in a much better position than he had ever been in England, since he can, out of his high wages, acquire his own house and garden. He didn't think much of colonial taste. While the ambition of the wealthy colonist not unfrequently finds vent in building a large house, he has generally been brought up in too rough a school to care to furnish it even decently. His notion of furniture begins and ends with upholstery, and I doubt whether he ever comes to look upon this as more than things to sit on, stand on, lie on, eat off, and drink off. The idea of deriving any pleasure from the beauty of his surroundings rarely enters his head, and it is not uncommon to find a man who is making £5,000 a year amply satisfied with what an Englishman with 1/10 of his income would deem the barest necessities. The Australian Croesus is generally very little to snob, although his lady, in quotes, has a taste for display. When this desire for grandeur has led them to furnish expensively, they are unable to furnish pretty, and usually feel much less comfortable in their drawing room, in which they never set foot except when there is company, than when their chairs and tables are made by a working carpenter, or with their own hands out of a few deal boards. As for pictures, they're altogether abominable. Can you imagine a man with 5,000 a year, or 500 for that matter, covering his wall with chromos? The inferior kind of these popularisers of art, as the papers call them, have an immense sale here. Even when a wealthy man has been told it is his duty to buy pictures, the chances are that he will attend an auction and pick up rubbish at low prices, rubbing his hands over what he considers a good bargain. Or, if he wants to tell his visitors how much he gave for his pictures, he gets mediocre work with a name on it. A recent number of the Adelaide Punch has a caricature entitled I Heart in Adelaide, which, though of course caricature, is worth quoting as showing how the wind blows. Tallow fat, pointing to a picture in a dealer's shop. What's the price of that there thing with the trees and the us in the distance? Dealer, that's a gem by Johnston, a local artist of some merit. 20 guineas, sir. Tallow fat, 20 Tom Falls, what do you take me for? Why, I bought a picture twice that size, with much more colour in it, and a frame half as thick again, and I only paid 10 for it. Show us something with more style. The subject that really aroused Richard Tiffany was servants. About servants in the colonies would go on for hours. Their laziness, their ignorance, their pretentious ways, keep him going page after page. When we were first out here, we used to run amok with our servants about once a week, but now we find it best to bear the ills we have and fly to others that we know not of. Our present Lizzie is impertinent to a degree when reproved, but then she can cook decently, and she is the first decent cook we've had since we've been out here. When you have lived on colonial fare for a few months, a good plain dinner covers a multitude of sins. Unfortunately, 4/5 of our servants are Irish, liars and dirty. These Irish are less impertinent than colonials, but if you do get hold of a well-trained colonial, she is worth her weight in gold on account of her heterogeneity. Your Irish immigrant at 8 and 10 shillings a week has as often as not never been inside any other household than her native hovel. and stares in astonishment to find you don't keep a pig on your drawing room sofa. On entering your house, she gapes in awe of what she considers the grandeur around her, and the whole of her first day's work consists of ejaculating, "Lord, goodness!" We once had a hopeful of this kind who, after she'd been given full instructions as to how a rice pudding was to be made, sat down and wept bitterly for half an hour, till, her mistress having told her to bake, the happy thought struck her to put a dish full of rice in the oven, sans milk, sans eggs, sans everything. Another biddy, engaged by a friend of ours, having to make a yeast cake, put it under her bedclothes just to flop it a bit. A third, having been given a bill of fare for the day, put soup, meat and pudding all in one pot and served them up as a potpourri. But that ignorant Irish were better, he considered, than ugly colonials, who did not and would not know their place, and who expected far better treatment than they should have. They asked for higher wages than they deserved. One girl got 15 shillings a week and still would not stay, preferring to go off and work in the sweatshops that made bonnets and garments of all sorts, rather than live comfortably at everyone's beck and call, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in a house. The fact that they could not call their souls their own, and that the mistresses did not know how to deal with it, never seems to have occurred to him as a reason for them preferring to work for low wages harder in the sweatshops. He seems to think it was just their general Jack's as good as his master colonial attitudes that made them feel like this. He's in a constant amazement of it. As for the food in the colonies, especially Adelaide, he says it's cheaper and more plentiful, but poorer in quality. Having said that, it turns out that he's really talking with an Englishman's educated palate. He goes on to admit that the working class food is an improvement in every way on what the migrants would have got in England and Ireland, of course. Meat in South Australia has travelled a long way on the hoof, and therefore it's not as tender and fat as he expects it to be, nor is it as delicately dealt with by the cook. Drink also, though cheap and plentiful, is often not up to what can be procured overseas. He says muscatel makes a delicious sweet wine in Adelaide that's very heady. I have no doubt better than I was to drink muscatel in the height of Adelaide summer. I have no doubt that in the course of time, when more scientific methods are pursued, South Australia will produce excellent ports and sherries, as well as Constantias, Malagras and Madeira. But I fear it will not be within the present generation. Claret, I understand from experts, will never be produced. On the other hand, there are some reasonable colonial vintages if you procure them from New South Wales or Victoria. Which the wealthy colonist is usually too much of an ignorant snob to serve. He'd rather offer his guests inferior imported wines. The amount of spirits drunk is really appalling. Not so much because of the amount drunk as because of the class who drink it. Here it is not merely the lower classes, but everybody that drinks. I presume he means every male. He doesn't suggest that the women tipple, although it was not unknown. Not a few of the wealthiest and most leading citizens are well known to be frequently drunk, though their names do not, of course, appear in the papers or in the police reports. No social reprobation attached to the drinker. He may be known to be carried to bed every night. For all it affects his reputation as a respectable and respected citizen. Generally, in fact, conditions are not very civilized, according to Tudor. How can you expect a man who, for the greater part of his life, has been eating mutton and damper and drinking parboiled tea 3 times a day to understand the art of good living? And, of course, even if he does, how can he find service to maintain a civilized way of life? Ye gentlemen of England who sit at home at ease, how astonished you would be to see your daughter Maud, whose husband is a well-to-do lawyer with considerable practice in Adelaide, setting the table herself because she cannot rely upon her servant doing it properly. And then she goes into the kitchen and teaches cook how to make pie crust. Her children are numerous, for her husband is not getting on quite so well as could be wished. She'll not be able to have a servant to wait at table. What wonder then if she gives up late dinner and has a meat tea, at which everything can be put on the table at once. A colonial-bred lady has generally learned something of good play in cooking, but generally the English mistress often breaks down before the serious and multifarious nature of her duties. It is by no means uncommon for her to be left suddenly servantless for 2 or 3 days. And if she does not possess great adaptability of disposition, the whole house is bound to be in 6s and 7s, and all its occupants, including herself, in anything but a pleasant state of mind. One feels Mrs. Twopenny might have, got a bit rough over it and left servantless, because she thinks fucking well about it. If a woman is worth her salt, she will not mind these things, or rather she will make the best of them. But it is not every English young lady whose love for her husband, present or future, will carry her through these domestic hurricanes. And if not, she had better not come out here, though husbands are plenty. In fact, he says everyone comes out here to get a husband. Except amongst a very small class who can afford luxuries, the girl of the period is out of place in Australia. The next writer is J.A. Froude. His books had such an influence on George Eliot, if you remember. He arrived here in 1885, and for the first, and perhaps the last time, a traveller had a good word to say about the way we talk. Froude was looked after by a court official when he arrived on the 18th of January, 1885. The first thing that struck me, and the impression remained during all of my stay in Australia, was the pure English that was spoken here. They do not raise the voice at the end of a sentence as the Americans do, as if with a challenge to differ from them. They drop it courteously, like ourselves. No provincialism has yet developed itself. The tone is soft, the language good, the aspirates in the right places. My friend talked fast about all sorts of things on our way to the pier. So apparently Froude had plenty of opportunity to judge his accent. This, of course, is in direct contradiction to what the inspectors of the schools said, who claimed that the colonial accent was appalling. The chief duty of young schoolmistresses out in the bush was to teach the children to talk properly. When we landed, he took me first to his house adjoining, a sort of bungalow with a garden, and a few trees to keep off the heat. He produced a bottle of Australian hock, light and pleasantly flavoured, with some figs and apricots. We then walked out to look about us under the shade of our umbrellas. They took a train to the city, which Froude found a busy England over again, set free from limitations of space. He delighted in the city, especially the garden. That night they sailed on to Melbourne. Adelaide had seemed a great thing to me, but Melbourne was a real wonder. He spoiled it, you see, he spoiled it all. When Mark Twain, the author of so much that the writers all in our youth, I suppose we've all at some stage been exposed to at least Huckleberry Finn, when he arrived in 1897, he came by train. First one who mentions arriving through the hills, and therefore had the pleasure of seeing our natural beauty, which indeed he appreciated very much. He evidently did his homework most competently, because he begins this chapter in his book on the colonies on South Australia by giving a very well-written, very neat, very factual account of our history, of the whole development of the province. And he also mentioned something not generally known, which I've not seen referred to, perhaps my lack of research, but I haven't seen this mentioned in anything else I've read. He was very struck by meeting on this train journey an American who was coming over to buy the whole output of kangaroo hide for the year, £30,000 worth, which he was sending back to America to make into shoes, where they would be called some other leather, not kangaroo. Now, Mark Twain was absolutely enthralled with this discovery. He goes on and on about it. He says, you know, this man is unique. He's the only man in the world buying a whole outfit of kangaroo leather. And he says there is more than one coat. There's only one man buying leather. It's so exciting. There was a boom on when he arrived, and he claimed this was the result of gold being found in Coolgardie. According to Mark Twain, South Australia was a bit inclined to sit and let the blessings flow from other colonies into it. I think one has to remember that he is at heart a humorist. And I'm never too sure in reading his writing, how far this light irony extends to his factual account of Adelaide. However, he says that South Australia has shared her neighbour's prosperity, but she deserves much, for apparently she is a hospitable home for every alien who chooses to come, and for his religion too. She has a population, as per the latest census, of only 320,000 odd, and yet her varieties of religion indicate the presence within her borders of samples of people from pretty nearly every part of the globe you can think of. Tabulated, these varieties of religion make a remarkable show. One would have to go far to find its match. And then he gives all the published religions: Church of England, Roman Catholic, Wesleyan, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Bible, Christian, Primitive, Methodist, Baptist, Christian Brethren, Methodist, New Connection, Unitarian, Church of Christ, Society of Friends, Salvation Army, New Jerusalem Church, Jews, Protestants, Anglican, Mohammedans, Confucianisms, other religions, not stated, etc. And in the title, Other Religions, he includes agnostics, atheists, believers in Christ, Buddhists, Calvinists, Christadelphians, Christians, Christ Chapel, Christian Israelites, Christian Socialists, Church of God, Cosmopolitans, Deists, Evangelists, Exclusive Brethren,
Free church, free Methodist, free thinkers, followers of Christ, gospel meetings, Greek church, infidels, Maronites, Mennonists, I can never pronounce that word, Moravians, Mormons, Naturalists, Orthodox, others indefinite, pagans, pantheists, Plymouth Brethren, secularists, Seventh-day Adventists, Shakers, Shintoists, Spiritualists, Theosophists, Town Mission, Welsh Church, Huguenot, Hussite, Zoroastrian, when there is only one. About 64 roads to the other world. You see how healthy the religious atmosphere is. Anyone can live in it, he says. They're all there, and all the big sects of the world can do more than merely live in it. They can spread, flourish, and prosper. He was also impressed with the flora and fauna, in particular the kookaburra, because he was convinced it was laughing at him. And I suppose to a confirmed humorist, it might be rather fun to have that sort of audience wherever you went. And the dingo, for which he makes an impassioned plea as a really lovable dog-like creature which should not be tormented or underdone. And the thing that really impressed him, apart from the religions, was the feat represented by the telegraph line from Adelaide to Port Darwin. South Australia built the line and did it in 1871-72 when her population numbered only 185,000. It was a great work, for there were no roads, no paths. 1,300 miles of the route had been traversed but once before by white men. Provisions, wire and poles had to be carried over immense stretches of desert. Wells had to be dug along the route to supply the men and cattle with water. For once this natural tone of light humour and irony is missing. He comes from a country where gigantic feats of this sort of road engineering and so on are developing the outback, the western frontier, and I suppose he knows what it entails. Someone perhaps from smaller Europe mightn't realise what feat they might be able to envisage. The thousands of appalling country, thousands of miles of appalling land over which the line had to go. He's aware of what it involves, but his tone of irony comes back when he begins on the politics of South Australia. In South Australia, the working man is sovereign, as vote is the desire of the politician. Indeed, it is the very breath of the politician's being. The Parliament exists to deliver the will of the working man, the government exists to execute it. The working man has great power everywhere in Australia, but South Australia is his paradise. He has had a hard time in this world and has earned a paradise. I'm glad he has found it. And especially when he talks of the original settlers. There seems to be no death rate for the old people. There were people at the commemoration banquet who could remember Cromwell. There were 6 of them. These old settlers had all been present at the original reading of the proclamation in 1836. They showed signs of the blightings and blastings of time in their outward aspect, but they were young within, young and cheerful and ready to talk and talk all you wanted, in their turn and out of it. They were down for 6 speeches and they made 42. The governor and the cabinet and the mayor were down for 42 speeches and they made 6. They have splendid grit, the old settlers, splendid staying power. But they do not hear well, and when they see the mayor going through motions which they recognise as being introduced from the speaker, they think they are the one, and they all get up together and begin to respond in the most animated way. And the more the mayor gesticulates and shouts, sit down, the more they take it for applause. The more excited and reminiscent and enthusiastic they get. And next, when they see the whole house laughing and crying, 3 of them think it is about the bitter old-time hardships they are describing, and the other 3 think laughter is caused for the jokes they have been uncorking, jokes of the vintage of 1836, and then the way they do go on. And finally, when ushers come and plead and beg and gently and reverently crowd them down to their seats, they say, oh, I'm not tired, I could bang along a week. And they sit there looking simple and childlike and gentle and proud of their oratory and wholly unconscious of what is going on at the other end of the room. And so one of the great dignitaries gets a chance and begins his carefully prepared speech impressively and with solemnity. When we, now great and prosperous and powerful, bow our heads in reverent wonder in the contemplation of those sublimities of energy, of wisdom, of forethought, of up come the immortal 6 again in a body with a joyous, hey, I've thought of another one. And as if they go, with might and main, hearing not a whisper of the pandemonium that salutes them, but taking all the visible violences for applause, as before. And a pity, too. These lovely old boys did so enjoy living their heroic youth over. In those days of their honoured antiquity, and certainly the things they had to tell were usually worth the telling and the hearing. The next visitors to write about our province were very different from the American writer.
No one, I imagine, has ever described Beatrice and Sydney Webb as humorous. No one that I know has ever ascribed to them the least vestige of sunny wit or even irony. They're capable of rather arid, satirical writing on occasions when they saw something they didn't like, and a lot of what they saw they didn't like. In fact, their manner of describing what they found in Australia is, on the whole, peevish, snobbish, and at the least dryly appraising. However, in Adelaide they found something to praise, which is better than they did in other colonies, albeit faintly and very patronising. They're here in 1898, and they said, Adelaide is a charmingly attractive city, wisely planned and full of amenity, unostentatious and refined, courteous and homely, reminding us constantly of Christchurch, New Zealand, on a larger scale. It is a capital, which Christchurch is not, and thus it resembles more than any English town we know a German Residenzstadt, the capital of a principality, with its park, its gardens, its little court society, its absence of conspicuous industries, and its general air of laying itself out to enjoy quietly comfortable life. Reminds you of one of those places described by Thackeray in Band of Fair, doesn't it? On the other hand, it lacks the charm of the German in history, in art, especially music and theatre, and in scholarship. It has the interest of democratic politics and of an ever-progressive mobility. It is to be hoped that it will gradually add some of the charms of the German city. Music, for instance, by means of a band, if not by means of opera house, might easily come. The little university may develop some scholarship. And there's already the nucleus of a public art gallery. Adelaide has, in fact, more chance than any other Australian city of becoming the Weimar, or more precisely, Stuttgart of the southern hemisphere. They do go on to say that we have an excellent educational system compared with the other colonies, because of partly, which is pleasant to know. In fact, they say, we found Adelaide perhaps the pleasantest of all the Australian colonies, and this was in spite of them finding the Premier, Kingston, the most objectionable of all the colonies. The final summing up of Australia in general was too great and ambitious for affection, and yet not great enough for respect. Frankly, I'd rather they abused me than praised me. I'd be highly suspicious to take any real praise from the Webbs. The next writer was quite charming, with the first to herself being described as a rat. She wrote letters home to her mother, who was a peevish bitch who kept insisting on Lady Audrey Tennyson keeping in touch with her coming home eventually. Couldn't bear her daughter being out of her clutches. But while Helen Tennyson was the governor here in 1900-1901, he went on to become the third Governor-General of Australia after Federation. Lady Audrey Tennyson wrote home to her mother long, long letters, 17, 20 pages, about life in the viceregal circles. And it's a marvellous description of life seen from the view of upper middle class English lady. The problems were many, and they weren't only physical. Wednesday I had a large meeting in the ballroom to plead on behalf of the Mothers' Union, of which I am the president, not for funds but for members. For I'm sorry to say the want of religion out in these colonies is really terrible. The immorality among the lower classes is increasing dreadfully. So I'm thankful to say we are not so bad yet as the other colonies, and we hope by encouraging the society workers to take up, and we help the others to join, to be persuaded to teach their children religion. I'm afraid at present many of the upper class mothers teach very little religion. It is all very piteous and heartrending, and the more one inquires, the worse things are. The bishop will come and speak to us first. I have simply sent out a card. Lady Tennyson home, 2:30 August 15th, in the close, these slips of paper. We have asked over 200, probably only 2/3 will come, actually only a third came. And I fear many will come simply to come to Government House without any idea of helping. We shall have tea afterwards. Conditions, of course, were very different from what she was used to. On a trip up the Murray, across the little station called Carlton, belonging to some people called Robinson Squatters. The whistle, as they say, the steamboat. So they came out and were delighted to see us. Found another 2 girls, governess and young man friend. Poor Mrs. Robertson, very low, anxious over the bad times which the old years had brought. Told me they could only just make 2 ends meet, so they have 100 square miles of property. And she had 11,000 sheep this year, which is considered a mere nothing out here. The station adjoining them, called Cobb Dog Run, we steamed past for 15 hours at 6 miles an hour, between one boundary fence and the other. The girls helped their mother do all the housework and cooking, catch the horses, saddle and harness them, but they never know if they're one or perhaps both maids won't say she'll be off, and go off within the hour. Once again, you see, it's the uncertainty of service. Gentlefolk really have to be able to turn their hand to anything. Actually, Lady Tennyson made no social distinctions between the different settlers because they're all below her anyhow. She like Queen Victoria, she was very nice to them at any level. She sees the Germans as universally acknowledged to be the best colonists. They live on nothing. The saying is they live on an oil rag. I think she means the smell of an oil rag. Hard-working and so thrifty and keep a good deal for themselves, often whole townships and nothing but Germans. Maybe there's good economic reason for being so fond of the Germans, because she then goes on to say that after leaving Overland Corner, we steamed down to a German settler lower down the river to load 17 tons of wood on board, as the Germans sell it so much cheaper than other settlers. 3 and 6 tons instead of 5 or 6 shillings per pound of basic steel. Then, as now, bushfires were a menace. 10th of February 1901, Marble Hill, Sunday. It was warming up again, and I'd been round shutting all the windows. The only chance of keeping the house cool was by shutting up the instant the thermometer begins to rise. Thursday was a terribly hot morning. We simply had bushfires raging all round us. Really a most wonderful sight. All the hills bursting with great volumes of smoke, great clouds of smoke rolling along the gullies. 2 days before, while we were at luncheon, Lady Baker from Bungalow telephoned for help. All our men, chicks and Lord Richard, tore off and had to work hard to keep off. I wish you could have seen one of the distant hills on Thursday night, all blazing from end to end, mildly. It was the most gorgeous sight for miles. And at a distance you can see no movement of the flames. It simply looks perfectly still and like the most magnificent illumination. There's something very ironic in that when you consider that early in the 50s, the 1950s, Marble Hill was burnt down by bushfires and certainly filled up since. It's difficult to say which she found hardest to cope with, actually, with problems nature or the problems made by man. The want of religion out here is very heartbreaking, and the awful tyranny of the Labour and Radical Party ruling power is beyond words. So, she was upset to leave. She really liked us in spite of our crude colonial ways. Quite unlike the next writer, and I was running my time, I'll try to do that. The next writer who could find no good word to say for the state or its inhabitants. Some of you would have read about her already, because after I'd done some research on her, someone brought out a book. Adelaide is largely inhabited by the type of man that wears celluloid collars and travels on coastal boats. To be sure, there are a few male inhabitants who have neither qualification, but these are mainly bankrupt and therefore do not count. Thus Thistle Anderson in 1905. He too felt that drink was one of the problems in South Australia. It is fairly safe to assume that their bankruptcy is due to their contempt for celluloid collars and their disregard of Adelaide's social laws, combined in many cases with a large devotion to Bacchus. There's so many interlocking layers of insult in her writing that it's hard to tease them all out. It reminds me of that famous one, not hers of course, Sir, under the pretense of keeping a boarding house, your mother received stolen goods. You know, you really hard to see what's being insulted. She refers to Adelaide, which by 1905 was really a thriving city, as the village. Most of the village's male population have married barmaids, nurses or money, so the social atmosphere is not as high as it might be. A few have risen superior to their environments, and these have done the wisest thing possible. Left Adelaide far behind and gone to better places. She mentioned that the only really good thing in Adelaide was the trains to the railway station, if they catch a train in Melbourne. So much for the men, but she was not a sexist. She also didn't like the women. The misfortune of the Adelaide women is that they were not born quadruped. They're a kind of mistake for cats. Moreover, they make one believe the old Spanish tradition that cats are descended from snakes. The outward semblance of the Adelaide female is intense respectability, and of course, in many cases being homely to look upon, and exceedingly badly clothed. She has no temptation to err from the paths of strict propriety. Not all Adelaide women, she says, are vicious. Some are just nonentities. They all lack address. Every gown she wears is a sartorial crime. She shows her hatred and jealousy for any who is better. It was surely a little falsely naive of her to be surprised when she received an enormous diatribe of hatred back from the inhabitants of Adelaide. They didn't want her. Under industries, she wrote,
The main industry of the village is childbearing, and Adelaide, both married and unmarried, does her best to help the birth rate. Motherhood may be the noblest mission of women, but I question whether the Almighty himself would approve of the perpetuation of some of the village family trees. Her real name is Mrs. Herbert Fisher. Good Lord Adelaide address while she was here. She came here with her husband in 1903. She claimed her writing was meant to be playful, and she also stated that she courted criticism. And if she really meant that, she must have been well satisfied. The response to her satire was claimed by exuberation. It's hard to stop quoting because every page is absolutely beautiful. But you can get hold of Arcadia and Adelaide, they're quite opposite, and you can read for yourself. Anyone asked if Thistle seems a bit tame and flat. But Conan Doyle, who came here to lecture on spiritualism in 1920, found something to appreciate in our wines. The product can be most excellent, but little or any ever reaches Europe, or it cannot overtake the local demand. In other words, we didn't make enough, export, we drank it all. The quality was good and purer than the corresponding wines in Europe, especially the champagnes, which seem to be devoid of that poison, whatever it may be, which has for a the dry tongue with internal acidity, driving elderly gentlemen to whiskey and soda. The Australian product, taken in moderate doses, seems to have no poisonous quality, and is without that lime-like dryness which appears to be caused it. If temperance reform takes the same course, insisting upon a lowering of the alcohol in our drinks, so that one may be certain that before one can be drunken, then this question of good, mild wine will evolve very largely in the future, and Australia may supply one of the answers. We only know the Australian wines at present by the rough articles sold in flasks, but when the supply is increased, the world will learn that this country has some very different stuff in the cellars, and will try to transport it to the next age. He liked Adelaide generally. He felt that his lectures had left a deep impression upon the town. He commented that the usual abusive messages poured in, including one wishing death upon him. People felt very strongly about spiritualism in 1920, but these were offset by the many letters of sympathy and thanks, so he left Adelaide with warm feelings. It does give pleasure to know that someone likes the place, doesn't it? By 1968, South Australia, as a totally agricultural community, no longer existed, when George, I never know whether you pronounce him Mickish, I'll call him George Mikes, because I can't, make any kind of attempt at the Hungarian way of pronouncing it. He was a Hungarian writer. They could talk of the insidious way industrialists in South Australia were modernising the establishment by sneakily infiltrating, marrying the establishment's daughters, getting themselves elected to the Adelaide Club, and becoming weekend graziers. As with Mark Twain, his manner of light irony makes it hard to decide how serious his approval is. But like Doyle, he approved of our wines. They are excellent wines, better than anything I have tasted outside Europe, better than many I have tasted inside Europe, and certainly better than the wines of California, where I once saw an advertisement, Californian Burgundy, beware of French imitations. And he says, it is an extremely agreeable place to live in. It has an atmosphere of kindness and relaxation. People are affluent and smiling. Perhaps they were in 1968. Did we feel affluent? Hopeful and polite. Adelaide is also becoming the Edinburgh of Australia. It has a biennial arts festival. It is a conservative occasion. Not much new ground is broken, but it is an increasingly high level and does a great amount of good to the arts as well as to Adelaide. And I think that's a good upbeat note to end on. We've had lots of other critics since. They've published kind and unkind things about us. But on the whole, people like our city who visit. We better not ask them to stay longer.